today's research paper session for this moment is called Problematizing the Black Male Experience in Education. We have a host of great panelists who will be presenting a paper at 15 minutes apiece. Our timekeepers are in the back and will give us the countdown of 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and 1 minute. The first presenters are Dr. Daniel Lovett and Sinclair Nicholson of Halifax Community College, the director of Pride Male Mentoring Program, and they will be talking about the broken spirits need healing, wellness, values, clarification, and life skill coaching. Please give a round of applause as they take the podium. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I hope you're enjoying your stay and the information is being shared as much as we are. I'd like to share with you some conversations that we've had and some programs that we've established to try to work with special populations on our campus. First, I want to share with you sort of a background on who we are so you'll know from what perspective we are approaching our initiative. We're at Halifax Community College. It's a part of a 58 community college system in North Carolina. We are what we call a predominantly black institution. We're in Weldon, North Carolina. We're 56% African American, 1,200 students on campus, about 3,500 continuing education students. 32% of our students are male, about 68% female. Halifax County, just to kind of give you a perspective on that location and region of the state, it's a county with many challenges. We're 96 among 100 counties in poverty. We're 97th in health disparities, and we're about 95th in post-secondary educational outcomes. So we're kind of in a desperate state in our county, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. In 2015, just this past year, we submitted a grant to the U.S. Department of Education, and we're fortunate enough to receive a $3 million grant that will last until 2020. And this grant is designed to establish the Pride Male Mentoring Program. Pride, by the way, stands for Preparing Men for Intellectual, Academic, and Educational Success. The program targets 150 African American and minority men. Pride is a comprehensive, high-touch program with lots of wraparound services and support. And I think the foundation of our program are our 3 learning, wellness, and success coaches. They operate from sort of a case management approach, so they are working with special populations of men on our campus, and they're responsible for virtually everything that happens with them in the campus environment. Wellness, values, and clarification and life skill coaching was a pilot program that we established. And to kind of give you some details on where we are, the focus really was to establish an alternative student support services initiative, one that refocuses the methodology from single traditional academic service delivery model to one that systematically integrates academic services and therapeutic wellness interventions. The program focuses on personal, emotional, and environmental stressors that negatively impact student success outcomes and progress. And for many weeks, we just simply called them problems that students were experiencing. But through some dialogue, through research, particularly from Claire Xanthos, we found out that there was a title designation for these, and they were called, again, stressors. And that was the language that we then started to use. The target group for the program was men with low academic performance, and I think that's the target for most individuals, those that were probation and or returning from suspension programs, those who were facing financial eligibility challenges. We were trying to get them back on track because they were basically in a position to lose their financial eligibility, and with that, for us, generally means loss of a student. We work with students also that consistently share their stressors, so told us their stories, their problems, their challenges that they were having. Again, they were working with success coaches, so that the coaches were very in tune to the challenges that they were experiencing. We also worked with exceptional children, which is what they call it in North Carolina, which are students with learning disabilities. And that group comes to us with have high school IEPs, individual education plans. So there is a target of number of students who enter our campus environment without these supportive services simply are not going to probably exist. Those that had 2 developmental education courses, those that referred to us from early alert systems. And almost any student or male or minority male who has been submitted or recommended to us for any type of at-risk behavior, whether it be missing class, missing a test, attending class late, whatever the factors are, was a group that we wanted to work with. The pilot group consisted of 13 students initially. And a perspective on the terminology I want to share with you. Broken spirits need healing. And what we simply are saying that broken doesn't mean that they cannot be successful. For us, it meant that there was some fracture in their lives, there was a little bit of damage perhaps. They were no longer in one piece, but they were still whole individuals. They were dealing with spiritual challenges as well as some others. And for the spirits, we focused on that for two reasons. Number one, we felt like a spiritual component was important in this, and it includes that faith-based. One part of it is a faith-based spiritual component, and the other is just the spiritual, the essence of who the person is, the non-physical part of a person, the seat of emotions, the soul, the character, mental consciousness, and unconsciousness. Wellness for us was defined as conscientious, self-directed, and involving process of achieving full potential. And that's what we wanted to sort of redirect the students. We knew what they were facing in many cases. At least we thought we knew. And as I talk a little bit further, we realized that there was a lot we didn't know. Multidimensional and holistic, encompassing the lifestyle, mental and spiritual well-being, and the environment. So we're dealing again with the whole individual. And in terms of healing, we thought we were dealing with process of making or becoming sound or healthy again. So the whole focus is taking a student who may appear to be challenged and has reported challenges, and then try to give them all the supportive services that we thought would be beneficial to them. So what did this entail? And I'm going to speed up my pace because my time is going to elude me. What we did was we had to shift from this traditional model of tutoring, early alert, advising, and financial aid, one that I think we probably used around the country, and one that we actually submitted to as a part of our grant process. And we wanted to offer we had a traditional, comprehensive, robust program with numerous support services, but what we continued to experience was students were leaving in inordinate numbers. So it was indeed a challenge for us. The program we started by having these conversations, and it started with a focus group because we wanted to explore these conversations more. And what we found out was that when we were in focus group environments, the conversation was very sterile. It was didn't seem authentic. They were telling us what they felt in the presence of people like us who they thought would also be in a position to perhaps even challenge them in ways. So that model really didn't work for us. So we evolved into something we call rap sessions. And rap meant release any pressures. So it's a conversation about anything you wanted to have a discussion about. And in these rap sessions, the focus was common struggles men experience daily. It was a safe, confidential setting to be heard and understood. It was an opportunity for them to give voice to their personal struggles. And we talked about that in some other sessions. They have to have the voice. People have to hear them and have to recognize that people hear them. An opportunity to release and remove your past stressors. And what we're trying to focus on life with clarity, determination. But, and even with these rap sessions, we found that some men needed even more. And we found they needed more because many discussions included these deep-rooted personal concerns, things that we really weren't equipped to deal with. Men sometimes became emotional, shedding tears, and almost breaking down in these sessions. There was anger, pain, indifference, frustration, displacement, blame. So we know that we needed more. We need to have somebody else to come in and assist us with these programs. So what we gathered from that information was that the students were asking, why me? Personal social coping stressors, how do you deal with them? They didn't even know the terminology, they didn't even know they existed. They know that they had lived this life for all these years, but they didn't know what they were really experiencing. Fragmented families, absent father. We had the low expectations, and that comes from some other environment. In other words, school, and maybe even in homes where the expectations were low. Peer pressure, racism and discrimination, judicial system profiling, health and finances, basic survival. These were all the kind of conversations, that we were having with these guys, or they were having with us. So our model shifted to one that dealt with, again, personal wellness, dealing with human stressors, personal issues, and environmental challenges that they were facing. Now, where did we get this model from? Well, we did some research, and we found, again, that the language was there, the narratives were there, but it was very abridged, very little information about these health and wellness issues for African Americans, at least in the research and in the literature reviews. Just wanted, again, to address the stressors. Teach or training process. We still wanted to make sure we didn't just give them information, we wanted to immerse them into an environment that would help them change themselves, something they could keep with them. So we established, we kept talking about more, so we simply pulled those same acronyms, more, and decided minimizing obstacles that reduce empowerment. That's what we call this program. They explored deep-rooted personal concerns, conscientious, goal-directed, disciplined, self-directed approach to succeeding, and it was a safe, confidential environment. And I said it because one of the things we had an opportunity to do was work with them in small groups. So when they walked into that meeting, it was a group bond. Chairs were centered in circles, were set in circles. There was always the credo, which we always used before the session started. That was a sort of a brotherhood feeling. Some say it was kind of fraternal, but it was an opportunity for us to try to bring groups of people together who were different, but had a lot of similar challenges. Theirs may just be their challenges just had some differences. The individuals we found, because we realized we couldn't provide all the services, were a doctorate in education, social development, history, and wellness. One of the local experts in our region came in and helped us with these sessions. He brought with him a certified wellness coach. And we also had our learning, wellness, and success coaches were also a part of the process, because we now needed to train the trainer process. When they leave, we needed to be able to continue the program. And the social therapy, we had one of our learning coaches had social work therapy, therapeutic group experience. So that helped a lot, because that was one of his fortes and one of his interests. And the methodology, we had bi-weekly group sessions that were 2 hours each. Counselors were available daily. So even when those coaches the experts were not there, our learning coaches were there. It was directed self-awareness conversations, and at the bottom of this, we said we identified 2 instruments that we used to try to focus on our assessment. Now, again, the program, as I mentioned, it began with a credo, a confidentiality vow, which means that what stays in here stays in here. And the language was okay to use. Whatever your feelings exerted was okay in this environment. Passive and aggressive discussions, we joined hands and did spiritual activities. The closing ceremony included awards and recognitions for those who had stuck with the program and done well. The instruments that we used were the problem-solving inventory, because we know that this was all about solving challenges. And the other was an internal locus of control instrument, because we know then that also we needed people to understand that they were empowered or could become empowered to create their own change. And both of these instruments actually had a continuum of services and programming that supported it. So after the program went away, after the surveys and instruments ended, there were still online services that we could direct them to or use to try to support them. Program findings, one of the things we focused a lot on was body language. From the tough, macho manhood, closed shoulders, cross-leg environment to one that we saw them opening up for conversations and dialogue. Develop self-confidence. We wanted them to feel good about themselves at a time when perhaps they did not. The participants reported feeling more confident and resourceful. 78% reported needing more time to work through personal challenges, which means they bought into the program. They wanted to stick with it. And 82% believe that the wellness coaches were actually helpful people in this setting. Some of the other strengths, there was variation in age. We had ages from 18 to 54. We also had, we again used the therapeutic environment, and I think that's important that you continue to stick with those, that we stick with that. And the sort of the end result was we started again with 13 men, and we didn't have total success and did not expect it. And this was one of 2 initiatives that we had tried to work with high-risk students. We had 5 students that actually went on to graduate and earn their degrees from the program, which means there were 8 that did not. We had 2 that went on to earn their BS degrees, and and those 2 were doing well. But we also had the 7 drops, and these are the ones that are concerned us most. Now, some we couldn't avoid. 2 of them were health-related. One was because of dialysis, and he had challenges. He had moved to another city to get the kind of treatment he needed, because we're in a small town. And the other lost his wife during the program, so he actually withdrew himself from school because he had kids to take care of. The ECE were students, again, that were high risk, who had individual education plans. We knew they were at risk, and that's a target group for us, because we're still getting quite a number of those. And then financial, we did lose that one who had financial challenges, and we lost 2 because of family work, and one actually we lost, he drowned, or we lost him in the program, during the program. So we had different levels of success and challenges. So that sort of, I'll bring on Mr. Sinclair for the second part of this.
All right, since I'm down to the very end, I'll talk very, very briefly about the wellness coaches. We had to develop specific strategies, identify the appropriate coping strategies to deal with our student base, so that we made sure we understood what they were dealing with. They came to us with defense mechanisms, denying, distorting the things that they were dealing with, because understandably they didn't know how, had never been taught how to deal with their personal differences. The strength was our ability to recognize males that they are proud and may be unaware of their actual needs. Willingness to explain the logic behind the strategies that we were using. We were trying to build trust between grown, proud men that they should accept support, when in our communities, asking for support meant that you had something wrong with you. So we had to conquer that fear. Understanding that the client or our students were likely to be skeptical about our offering support to them. And overall, the learning coaches are the most valuable resource that you will have as a part of support, because they are that direct one-on-one support. Thank you.
Okay, so let's hear it for our first presenter, Dr. Daniel Lovett and Mr. Sinclair Nicholson. And next up to the podium, thank you, we're going to have Dr. Lana Talbot, child psychologist here at the Bermuda Ministry of Education. She's going to talk about understanding the implications of problematic sexualized behavior in black males and family intervention.
Good morning. This piece of research illuminated out of an article that I published called Understanding Concerns and around sexualized behaviors in children. And as I was doing some practical work, I realized that young children were being referred to me, in particular black male boys. And as I started to work with black male boys, I realized that the problem was they were referred for behaviors, but as I started to explore more deeply, I realized that there were underlying factors that actually caused the behaviors to be present. The prevalence of sexualized problematic behaviors in the black family, it's not a new phenomenon, and it's not just a black thing. In fact, you can find it in every racial group. Child sexual abuse is not a black thing. Statistics show that blacks are sexually victimized in childhood at about the same rates as whites. And when we look at the black community, the prevalence of children being sexually abused is somewhat of a puzzle and somewhat of a challenge. Often we hear about female children being abused, but actually black male boys are also abused, and seldom spoken. It's more of a taboo subject. At least 14% of all young victims of sexual assault are male, according to police reports in the US. The reluctance of boys to report abuse, coupled with the fact that males are rarely asked about childhood sexual abuse by mental health providers, may explain why some boys are underrepresented in psychiatric samples and studies done by Putin. 20% of sexual abuse of boys is committed by women. Among blacks, often homophobia perpetuates the denial of sexual abuse of boys. In Bermuda, the most recent statistics I could get from the Department of Child and Family Services in 2014, at least 37 boys reported being sexually abused. And then this does not take into consideration the cases that go unreported. Examining the theory of prevalence of sexual abuse in boys and in the black community is that black community tends to have a collectivist culture. And in this collective culture, it's one that's based on valuing the needs of a group or community over the individual. And so sometimes it's not reported, it's not talked about, because we're busy protecting the actual community and not the individual. People tend to work together to create harmony, and group cohesion is extremely valued. A few of the common traits of collectivism cultures that impact sexual abuse in the black culture is social rules focusing on promoting selflessness and putting the community needs ahead of individual needs. Working as a group and supporting others is essential. People are encouraged to do what's best for society, and families and communities have a central role. The collectivist cultures, people are often considered good if they're generous, helpful, and dependable, and attentive to the needs of others. And this is in contrast to the individualistic cultures that often place a great emphasis on character, such as assertiveness and individualisticness. And that is an independence as well, and that's common like in cultures such as Japan, China, and so forth. Stephanie Hargrove in 2014, she theorized that it was more, the collective culture within the black community was more due to perhaps systematic oppression faced by the African community, also possibly the intergenerational transmission of abuse, and also personal culpability. Another theory behind it is that there has been a relaxation in family practices. Major increase in the variety of sexual behaviors in children is due to family sexuality. In other words, we have relaxed how we set boundaries up for children, such in some families we have co-sleeping, co-bathing, family nudity, opportunities to see adult movies. Children tend to witness sexual acts through TV, video, with the modern technology, all sorts of ways they get their hands on it. And families often forget to set boundaries around these areas. And sometimes, although I don't have it here, it says sometimes due to economic factors within families, these things tend to happen. The impact of problematic sexualized behaviors on the black males is that sometimes it has a great impact on their social and cognitive development. Childhood sexual abuse has been correlated with higher levels of depression, guilt, shame, self-blame, eating disorders, somatic concerns, anxiety, and disassociative patterns, repressive denial, sexual problems, and relationship problems. We also see in children sometimes when they have been abused, and boys in particular, emotional distress, oppositional behaviors, non-sexual aggression, coexistent mental health problems, learning disabilities tend to increase, and victimization through indiscrimination of friendliness of sexually explicit behaviors. Often the systems also play a role in terms of how it impacts young men, because the influence of the systems in place often do not allow for true healing or treatment of the black male youth. When black children have been victimized, they tend to display maladaptive syndromes of their abuse, and they tend to be labeled and stigmatized for their actions. This phenomena is often demonstrated in what we heard a lot of this week, the school to the prison pipeline, that has become more and more prevalent in our school systems worldwide. A disturbing national trend in children are funneled out of the public school and often into alternative settings, and from alternative settings perhaps to a juvenile setting, and then into the juvenile and the criminal justice system, because we often don't address the socio-emotional needs of the child who has encountered or gone through such an experience. Many of our children are affected by this institutional trend are students of color in most cases, often boys, and often they are the ones who will be having learning difficulties, or they have histories of poverty, abuse, or neglect. And I believe I looked at the data from Child and Family Services, there's a high percentage of children in Bermuda who fall in the category of neglect. Very few take time to look past the overt behaviors and then really examine the covert pain that emulates from a history of abuse, which unfortunately places the black youth in a predicament of getting punished or remediation rather than having effective help to heal. In terms of the school to prison pipeline, it impacts us in terms of the school policies and the procedures that drive many of our school systems. They often push children to a pathway that begins in school and ends in the criminal justice system. Also, due to a lack of mental health professionals and services located in schools to address these children's needs, it's often a common problem. We must rethink how schools are set up to address these concerns. We have to be responsive to all children and their families and their communities. Too frequently, schools respond in a more of a punitive approach, and often we realize that it's not working. This slide just shows quickly the pipeline of what happens to most children who encounter abuse, and particularly our male boys in the school system. When I reflect on, I just decided to do a little digging and to see if there was any correlation between the boys who were displaying behaviors related to having been sexually abused and what we see in our Bermuda prison system. I found that the black males, as we already know, are the highest rate percentage of males in prison in Bermuda. And Prison Commissioner Colonel Lamb, who was here earlier this first day of the conference, he indicated that in 2015, the capacity at the prison is 228 in Bermuda. The total of prison inmates are 141 in 2015, and the farm housed 54 inmates, and the co-ed population was just 14. In October, however, in 2016, that number has not changed drastically. As you can see now, we have 142 adult males in our 3 facilities. The female rate has gone down, and trainee, a child of 18 years old, we only have 1 at present. One of the troubling findings, though, as time changed, was that he indicated was that there's been a rise in the number of persons for sexual offenses. And as we know, most children who have been exposed to abuse usually later on become offenders as well. Another finding was a study done by Profiles of Bermuda, Cordell Riley, in which he looked at the prison population. It was called Profiles of the Prison Population in 2013. The findings of this study indicated that just over 1 in 10 inmates, 12% reported unwanted sexual contact. And the persons were generally known to the victim, and the abuse occurred before the individual was 18 years old. The other interesting fact was that the average age when the act actually occurred was at a minimum age at 12 years old, but the median age was 9. So we can see that it happened to children very early, that it did start at the school level. And there was a directional increase in the percentage who stated that abuse occurred more than once, at least 4%. The culture around, and the culture of silence, or the taboo that happens around us, that despite our children being bombarded with sexualized media images, parents and other caring adults often find it difficult to be open, have frank discussions around human sexuality and normal sexual development with their children. This sends implicit message to children that sexuality is a taboo subject. Sex is seldom openly discussed, which makes it next to impossible for the victims of child abuse to feel comfortable disclosing their abuse, particularly if they're this word's been bothering me a lot, is a member of the victim's social network. And what must we do? We must start first teaching our black males to be aware of what actions. I'm just skipping ahead because of time. I got to go back? Okay. No, I think I had it the right way. I was right. I was going the right way. Oh, dear. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I lost some time already. Okay. What must we do? We must first teach black males to be aware of what actions and behaviors are inappropriate instead of teaching them to be aware of the stereotypical bad guy image. We also must take time to instill more accountability and openness in the black community. We must teach the community to recognize the signs, and we must hold anyone accountable that they see being inappropriate for a child where there would be a lot of more people being brought to justice. The black community as a whole needs to be aware that there are people with malintent towards children in our community as well, and that the reactions of the first person the child tells about the abuse can determine the trajectory of what the child's healing process will be. Often, sometimes when children come up to an adult and try to disclose what has happened to them, they are dismissed. And often, teachers and educators don't know how to respond. And therefore, then we lose the child, because that's a very important and very significant moment. And what we have is, when this problem is not actually addressed, we have a generation of hurt young black men who never felt the freedom to report their abuse. And the deafening silence around this issue is ignored it continues to be ignored in some cases. The other thing we must do is we must encourage open discussion within our community. We must help to foster oral tradition of storytelling when parents and other caring adults communicate with their children about sexual issues. Also, to reduce the silence around sexuality, more open discussion, talking with parents, working with parents, and with educators to inform them of the concerns and how this has to be addressed. Often when we have male children in a school setting, we recognize that the problem is not just that labeled as behavior. The behavior is the outcome of what the child is actually dealing with. The power of relationships and open communication to break the silence surrounding sexuality and sexual abuse in the black community. These same networks that we can establish. You're saying I'm finished? Oh, okay. This time thing is quite difficult for me. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Talbot. Please be reminded that if you have a burning question that comes to mind, we'd like you to think about that, write that down, so when we get to the question and answer Q&A portion of the panel, you can ask some very succinct questions that we can address more than just a couple, okay? And now I'm going to introduce Mr. Leon Caldwell of Caldwell and Associates. He's going to speak about Beyond Plight, Defining Pathways for Optimal Development of Black Men and Boys Across the Lifespan. Let's hear it for him as he approaches the podium.
All right, brother, Leon. There we go. Thank you so much. Let me just test it. Yep, it works. Okay, first of all, I'm going to say good morning.
Morning.
That was 30 seconds. I was trying to figure out a way I could actually do this like in the Hamilton play, so then it would be engaging and you know, I could rock the mic, but that's probably not going to happen. But I do want to start with the end in mind. So here's two questions and a statement, because I may not get to this towards the end. So the first question is, what narrative does your research support? Let's just keep that there, so when we get to the end, you'll get it. The second question is, do you understand the nature of the water of which black boys swim in? It'll make more sense when I get through this. The third thing is a statement. Publication should not be the goal of your work. It's only a stopping point, okay? All right, so here we go. Let's get through this really quick. So first of all, let me just go back to here. And speaking of narrative, this notion of beyond plight, part of this work, or a large part of this work, is I really got tired of the narrative that people describing me as obsolete, dangerous, all the other stuff that goes along with being a black male. as if there's a monolithic black male story. We heard Dr. Franklin talk about this yesterday. Many of my colleagues' work also discusses this as well. But what was really important is that if you ask a lot of folks in community, and even if you ask about your work, most of us can describe the water that people are drowning in, but very few of us have any real sense of how do you get the rope to them, right? And Mayor Harrington said this during one of our think tanks in Memphis, that he was always so shocked when we held this think tank for African American progress and the number of black academics who were actually engaged in driving solutions, because in his mind, he'd only thought of PhDs as being able to describe the water. Right? So I think it's relevant that this conference and some of your work will focus on what's the end goal. I'm going to zoom through a lot of these and get to some really high points. So the major thing of this slide is that how do we do a conceptual shift the paradigm from deficits to assets. Also that there is an ecological framing around our work. It's not just as we look at just the microsystem in the ecology, which is pretty much targeted towards black boys as the problem. Black men is the problem. We rarely look beyond that into the ecosystem. The third thing is the focus of this work is really on indicators and driving a conversation that's data-driven, right? Not just innuendo, not just hearsay, and not just anecdote. Like, at this point, we should be far more sophisticated in our analysis and even work with black boys and men. So let's be real clear. This is not new, even though some of you might just be reading actual framing of black men as deficits, excuse me, from the beginning of this country. That the work we're doing to undermine this deficit approach is not new work, right? So hopefully that helps you frame it as a continuum, if you will, and that your place in history is continuing the legacy. That, to be honest, we'll hear about some of these folks for lunch that Dr. White himself, as a pioneering black psychologist, actually forged. So here's where our research looks like. Here's how your research turns into policy, whether you know it or not. So it could be whether you want it or not, right? So super predators was basically some researcher sat somewhere, made up a phrase, took the phrase, put it in popular culture. Popular culture took it, start writing newspapers, mainly because white folks and black folks were at the time concerned about public safety, high murder rates, all this other stuff that was going on in the community, as if we were inherently murderous or homicidal, right? So then you see the result of research turns into policy. So all the young men in the orange jumpsuits, right? So you talk about prison to school to prison pipeline. It's all based on research that somebody did somewhere, right? So, having been this dancer of career-wise, going from academia as a tenured professor, jumping out of that into philanthropy, I actually had a different viewpoint of how philanthropy uses money, and wanted to be clear about let's use it for good and not just for people's interest. So I started having these meetings about how to use data to go beyond this plight narrative to one in which we're looking at what is the outcome of our work. I'm going to skip through these, and I really want to just get to this piece around the life course and the disentanglement of our work. Well, I should say it this way. The fact that most of our work is not integrated or aligned, right? So you see this, the siloing even on academic institutions, right? So you have one department talking about black mental health. You have another department talking about education and black mental health. You have another talking about the biochemistry of black mental health. Wouldn't it be nice if all three of them sat together and had some conversation about black mental health, right? And I think the concern that I have is that in the real world, what this looks like is a bunch of resources put out there that very few people actually braid or put together that make any sense for us, right? And our work, it makes it far more complicated than it has to be. So our work basically focuses on protective factors and this notion of optimal development. Right? So, and I asked the first question of, what narrative does your work support? The second question around, do you understand the nature of the water? Is many folks are just focusing on the problematized behavior without really understanding the larger framing of that behavior. I'll go through this because one of the hallmarks of this work is moving from this risk and adversity narrative to this notion of literally going from this adversity and risk conversation. So I always say prevention is the absence of an undesired behavior, but it doesn't really denote the presence of a desired behavior. And many of us don't have the conversation of, well, what's after prevention? Like, what are we actually promoting? So it's this idea that we have to think about promotive factors as much as we think about protective and risk factors and prevention. Some of this, obviously, I don't know, you can't read this that clearly, but so we came up with these indicators, a group of us that sat around, with a larger group that sat around, and we came up with 5, I think 6 actually, indicators: positive economic development, culturally responsive service systems, positive community development, what is that? Caregiver competencies, positive social networks, and positive self-image. These were indicators for us of what optimal development was. So if you actually took a more strength-based or asset-driven approach, you would find these things as being prevalent and present in black males who have actually succeeded. That's the other thing. I think we actually don't really study successful black males much. So I'm imploring some of you who actually want to do this work to start looking at those as models and not just a description of the plight. So here's where it gets, I think, real, and I'm speeding this up tremendously. We actually think of this work in a metaphor of fish and water, right? And let's just think of black boys as the fish. And typically, we describe the fish as healthy, unhealthy, has omega-3s, doesn't have omega-3s, has all this stuff in it. We just describe fish, right? We forget to look at the fact that these fish are actually existing in water. And we rarely describe the water that which the fish are swimming in, right? So I'm from West Philly. There's the Schuylkill River has fish. I would never eat fish out of the Schuylkill River. And some of you probably have communities in which you would never probably eat the fish out of, right? But we also we think about it as, oh, look, we have a place to fish, or fish are living. But are fish really living if, in fact, the water is toxic? So toxic water looks like this for us in our work. In terms of community environment, it's food deserts, punitive policing, going to school policy is problematic. Economic environment is poverty, there's wealth disparities. Service systems, they usually are ineffective services. In schools, you see a lot of suspensions. Caregivers, lack of health care, lack of well-paying jobs. I mean, this is the water, right? I'm just describing the water. Peers, there's idle youth, not an opportunity for positive youth development. There's gang involvement. So we would actually, our work is focused on both addressing the fish, meaning are they healthy, but more importantly, is the water clean, right? And how do we clean the water? So in a space where the water is, that black boys are swimming in, is full of nutrients, right? The environment is pure and clean. Then you have what it looks like, and again, the work of being, what's the end in mind, end goal, is positive community environments. Look like there's modeling institutions, there's positive role models, positive economic environment, is stable housing, there's family support, jobs to support the family income. There's in representative civic leadership and culturally competent teachers as part of a culturally responsive service. I mean, these are all indicators, right, that indicate if the water's clean. Strong advocates for children, knowledge of positive youth development. For peers, there's positive intergenerational connections and leadership roles and opportunities for youth to grow positively. So what we're doing with this work is essentially turning it into these kind of community maps, right? So we would come to a place, do an assessment, or you would actually, or a place would help do the assessment. Because one of the other issues that we have in many communities where this work goes is nobody really knows what everybody's doing, right? So there's these silos, these fragmentations. So how do you have one centralized place, one place in which there's a conversation around well, this is our inventory of interventions. This is our inventory. And even more importantly, this is the conceptual framing of our work, right? Are we just thinking about the fish, or are we thinking about the water? Excuse me. Then we create a map across the life course, because this is another issue, particularly in philanthropy, and I would imagine in most systems. You have one body of folks who are working on early childhood development, and then they stop, and they don't talk to anybody that's working on anything middle school, and the middle school is not talking to high school is not talking to higher ed's not feeding back the work. I mean, it's just, so you wonder kind of why we're still muddling in dirty water, if you will, or just stuck in mud, is because of the conversations we're not having, right? So this is just a way of framing that. And this, I'm gonna just kind of end with this particular slide, I think, yes. Because this is where I think the work gets real. If you think about both the system's assets and deficits, and then the individual. I mean, most of our work does focus on individual behaviors. And we have to rediscover that individual behaviors are influenced by the ecosystem in which people live in, right? So if you actually think about your work, and going back to the question is, do you understand the nature of the water? Then I'd implore you, and I'm telling you this as a kind of a caring person in research that's looking for, when I sit in these meetings in philanthropic spaces or at policy tables, they're always asking, where is the black research? Where's the black researchers? And when I pick up many of your stuff, you're not saying anything different than the white researchers. And that to me is problematic. So I'm asking you, begging you actually, we need to change our paradigms of research and not be consistent with what our advisors have done, if you haven't had an advisor like me, or not be consistent with the kind of the themes of which the plight narrative continually gets exacerbated. So I actually did not get the bell, nor did I get the one sign, and I'm stopping right there. I'm dropping the mic. Deuces, I'm out.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. So our next presenter, Dr. Gilman Whiting? Dr. Gilman Whiting, sorry about that. Vanderbilt University, the Director of Graduate Studies of African American Diaspora Studies. He will be speaking about black, white, and red all over, black males, scholar identity, and policing.
I'm in control of my own thing here. Good morning. Hey, I wanted all of us to take a moment while I get set up here to think about, and however you do it, have a thought for those who lost their lives this last week while we've been here during this storm. I have a friend in southern Florida who's been texting me nonstop about it, and it reminds me of Katrina when it was going on, and how I was getting messages from brothers down in Dillard and places like that as they're saying the waters were rising up in their buildings. So while we're doing this great stuff here, I just want us to take a moment just to think about them. And so greetings and thank you all. I'm actually glad to be on this panel because a lot of our work, as Brother Caldwell just says, we should get together and talk about it. I'm sure you'll add to that, and you'll see when I talk right now, because we're actually talking about it. I wish those younger brothers were here just now, because one thing I want to let them know is that there's a lot of things that are said during conferences, and we're not sure exactly what sticks into one's head, but I want to say that we never know where our research ends up. We don't know if it becomes policy or practice or those things. But I am about the doing of it these days, and we sometimes have to fight those battles. So at the same time, as we're always telling our students, make that way, we always know that there was one road, A to PhD, and then you figured out what you want to do after that. So I'm going to start us off with something for you to look at, because they said if the picture's worth 1,000 words, then I assume that a video will be worth a million.
In the 1950s, the battle for civil rights was fought in the classrooms.
I believe we've got to have laws that go along with education and understanding.
In southern states,
That's the other end of doing the thing. So the talk today is black, white, and red all over. And the premise of the Scholar Identity Institute, or the model that I wrote back in probably '04, is that the young men aren't broken. They're not less capable, less intelligent, less desirous of any of those things, and it's not just about them. So more of this, we can look at the research a little bit later on, but considering that we're not born with an identity, a self-concept, self-esteem, racial identity, gender identity, therefore we develop our identities, or more to the point, our identities are actually trained into us. So this work began some time ago, but I just wanted to put these pictures up because this has been going on across the country. Before it happened at Mizzou, it's been going on since before Trayvon Martin, but several of the students around the campus have been asking the question and having the conversations about what's going on. So a lot of that mental, psychological, and physical healing that we think they need, they're asking for by putting on these lectures and conferences. So black and white and red all over, scholar identity and policing. So in 1935, a French surrealist by the name of André Breton was credited with a term called le moi noir, which is basically black humor. In 1945, he coined this phrase for his book, The Anthology of Black Humor. It labeled a subgenre of comedy where skepticism and cynicism relying on such topics as dismemberment and death. In the anthology Black Humor, the reader exposed to writings of authors like Swift, Kafka, Poirot, Poe, and Baudelaire, just to name a few. The super revolt of the mind viewed what was macabre or ironic, often absurd, as normal. The terms black comedy or dark comedy later derived as alternatives to Breton's term. In black humor, topics and events that are usually regarded as taboo are treated as unusually humorous or satirical manner while retaining their seriousness. The intent of black comedy, therefore, is often for the audience to experience both laughter and discomfort, sometimes simultaneously. In the 1950s, this sick and black comedy were becoming mainstream in America. By contrast, blue comedy focused more on crude topics such as nudity, sexuality, sexual situations, and bodily fluids. According to Alan Doones, just before Breton's death in the mid-1960s, there was a new phenomenon. Here's where the title of this work kind of comes from. But the question began to germinate in 2008 when a law professor at Vanderbilt was trying to capitalize or cash in on the election of Barack Obama, insinuating that somehow or another, because of this new election, that stereotype threat was no longer an issue and we were truly post-racial. Of course, I challenged him and took my whole class there to let them see that was wrong. When I returned from the conference in Jamaica 2 years ago, this conference, this is where the real work began of collecting the data. A frustrated student asked me, what are we going to do? They're killing brothers out in the street, nobody cares. Then he said, I don't know how I'm going to handle this. That's when the real work began, because I asked him why, and he said, why am I even doing this shit? He put his hands up. I asked, doing what? He said, why am I trying so hard in school when they could just kill you for nothing and they can get away with it? So I recalled not yet being a teen some time ago, and there was another kid who asked me one time, what's red and black and white all over? And the answer to that has several answers, like, for example, an embarrassed skunk, a zebra with a sunburn, or newspaper, for example, with the play on red and read. But the crude sophomoric answer to this joke at that time was a dead baby wrapped in a newspaper. This phenomenon is what they called a dead baby joke cycle. There became a desensitizing riddle that was told with the objective to create or repeat the most gruesome jokes. This was going on during the 60s and the 70s. The effect of this blue or black crusade was to actually change how kids thought, how they reacted. And the medical field got involved with this, which developed the battered child syndrome. So American policy finally sat up and took notice, and in this research, dead baby jokes were found to be a form of public endangerment. So I said that if twisted jokes were affecting school-aged children mentally, what effect, if any, does the exposure of police-involved shootings, black and brown men, boys and girls, which prompted the creation, the rise of Black Lives Matter, the class of 1950, more recently, Colin Kaepernick in high school, revolts around the company, do these responses to historic events have any effect on the race consciousness of black and brown children, particularly males? We can be taught the constructs through the scholar identity model. So I've got a sign up that says I have just a couple of minutes. So what I want you to do is to think about how then do we answer these questions? How, from the research I'm looking at, study has about 250 males in it, ages 10 to 21 years old, two-pronged assessment of three-stage interview protocol by Irv Seidman up at UMass Amherst, emeritus professor. Trained on two constructs of the scholar identity model, which was race consciousness and masculinity. Used pre-post test measures to measure racial identity as well as masculinity. Questions were constructed for families and schools and members, and family ranges range between $13,000 and $800,000 in terms of incomes for the family. One-parent, two-parent families, and like the desensitizing effects of video games, particularly first-person shooters, gunfire in urban neighborhoods, many young boys and men display symptoms very similar to military soldiers from combat. So on the positive side, with cool polls and the other things, we can actually look at and combat some of these issues. That's my time, and I don't want to hear that gong, so I'm done.
Thanks so much, Dr. Whiting. All right, and so now our last speaker before we head over to lunch will be Dr. Lou Simmons, the Director of Academics here in the Bermuda Ministry of Education. He's going to speak on the educational trajectories of Bermuda's black males, stopping bullets, and building community wealth.
I don't need it. I can speak without it. Is everyone having a Bermudaful day? I'm taking advantage of the minutes that I have. Have yourself a Bermudaful week. For our visitors, find a Bermudian and ask them what that means. We hope you are enjoying it. My presentation really is about the education trajectories of Bermuda's black males, and the title is Stopping Bullets, Building Community Wealth. Just to give you insight into the purpose of this study, the purpose of this study was to juxtapose the education trajectory of black males. There we go. Yeah. The education trajectory of black males 12 to 18 in two of Bermuda's significant education reform periods, 1956 to 1972, and then 1997 to the present. And it's been a blessing listening to some of the work that has been spoken to at the table here, because it certainly informs a lot of this work, which is a part of a larger body of work. And my mentors like Haki Manabuti, Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Claude Anderson are all scholars who have helped to inform the greater body of this work. And Dr. Richard Majors actually is playing a significant part in terms of the development of this work with me. But both of these periods provide educational opportunity, or provided educational opportunity for black males, as they simultaneously carried overrepresentation of young black Bermudian men among those who have been incarcerated for violent crime as they received an education. Now, most notably in this work, the paper applies somewhat of a sociological theory to focus on a varied organizational structure of education systems and the impact of the socioeconomic aspects of these two periods on young black males. Interestingly, where the context of stopping bullets comes into play, between 1997 to the present, and especially from 2009 to the present, we've had a series of young men who have lost their lives through murder, gun violence, significantly about 30, and it's adding up since the last count. But most notably, in terms of these young men, is between that period of 1997 to the present, you can see evidence of how schooling and education may have had implications around their demise, or to their demise. And one is not saying it is the reason, but it is certainly a variable. Now, I want you to take some time and look at these three questions. And you may note just one question. I'm not going to elaborate on them because we have a Q&A or Q and Solutions section. I want to give full time or full complement to that period. So when you reflect on this here, take one of these questions, and if you want to ask me, I shall elaborate upon it. When we think in terms of theorizing what's been going on, in 1956, 1972, the Bermuda Technical Institute was designed as a normative model for a Eurocentric local education system. Now, at the time when this school was established in 1956, it significantly placed emphasis on black males attending this school for the sole purpose of becoming tradesmen. And becoming tradesmen to, of course, meet the demands and needs of the workforce. Now the tech, if we want to put this in the context of sociological theories, it's very much was a structural functionalism to their schooling experience. Highly structured. Many of the young black males between 12 to 18 who attended solely for the purposes of, as I indicated, trade development. And in the model of schooling that I described earlier in this trade development, which is also an individualized model, it is deemed that they had probably one of the most successful periods of education in Bermuda's history, namely because of the high standards of education. And these are the four core reasons. Oops. All right, let me just go back and make a comparison to the 1997. Let me just say something about the structure of the schooling system for 1997 to the present. This was a school process that was set up with lots of resistance and conflict. It wasn't necessarily a school reform period that the broader community, especially the black community, wanted, right? Significant to this structure was that we would take away 5 of the senior schools that we had in place, convert them to 5 middle schools, and we would only at the time have 2 senior schools. In that process, what happened, of course, you had an exiting because one of the senior schools in question that did not want to go wanted to go middle school, they decided to go private. Changed the landscape, changed the script, right? On top of it, with the 2 senior schools, with it came all of the resistance and conflict and assumptions, beliefs, that this would enhance and create gang activity in our young people, right? Tribal conflicts. So just think of that in the context of those questions that I shared with you earlier. Now I want to get back to the tech. So when you think of what was successful for the Technical Institute, what they claimed was successful in terms of their school structure, they maintained that the tech was a brand new school with no pre-existing cultural baggage, right? So if you think of that comparatively, brand new school, no cultural baggage. Young men are coming in there, no preconceived notions about where they are coming from, island-wide, no preconceived notions about which families they are attached to, right? And I'm quoting statements made by a former tech graduate, one of the 600 graduates of this school before they closed. But adding to their perceived success was also Bermuda Technical Institute was an all-boys school. And of course, with an all-boys school, one of the first things you say for 12 to 18-year-olds, and we know what the hormone developments are like during their time, where there were no girls present. So they got to focus, but it didn't indicate that, of course, when they went back to their social communities, that was their interaction. But the focus of schooling was on schooling. And so an all-boys school was somewhat celebrated. In addition, you had a teaching staff who cared. And when we say who cared, we're not just talking about from the emotional perspective. We're talking about a teaching staff who, for these young men of the day, because they're there to become tradesmen, their teachers were mentors in the field. And their teachers were just not from the limited context of vocational or technical, they were also academicians. So they brought a very highly structured intent to their discipline, where these young men understood the balance of academics with the so-called hands-on, right? And again, probably the most important thing that they attribute to their success has been, of course, a vocational focus, but one that was supported by, like I indicated, some of the best academics. We fast forward to 1997, and I've already spoken to some of this to, again, accelerate and move my time. But again, it was the two senior schools. And again, keep in mind that from a structural perspective, it was perceived that by having these two senior schools, and at the time was just a focus on the one in particular, that it will be a contributing factor to what the kids used to call in the day the beef. Neighborhoods against neighborhoods. And if you place that into the context of and the juxtaposition of these two reforms, 1956 to 1972, when the tech closed, and they say it closed because it was too successful, that's problematic. No one closes a successful school. The school was closed primarily because black males in that school exceeded the success beyond just becoming tradesmen. They became economic competitors to the predominantly white males in the community. They left the school becoming business owners. And if there's any default in this as we look at the critical analysis, adding to this whole tech or highly structured vocational tech framework versus the neighborless framework of 1997, because that's what they lost. They lost a sense of neighborhood when we brought into context this new structure. We introduced the whole concept of, or let's just say in terms of moving forward, when we talk about stopping the bullets and those 29, 30 young men who were a part of that 1997 to the present period, I would propose that if we're going forward, and I saw some in a lot of the work here, that we would need to restructure some of our middle schools, our senior schools, to have a balanced, blended learning experience of academic, vocational, technical curriculum. But that's just not enough. We have to establish strong value-centered rites of passage. And it's interesting, throughout this conference, you hear a lot about the rites of passage, which that isn't new. But we know from 11 to 16-year-olds especially, that's a critical period for the whole rites of passage movement, to deal with some of the emotional things that were spoken to by my colleague, Dr. Tarwood. So, as we are beginning to assemble and arrive at solutions, we must be courageous enough to at least step outside the comfort level of what has been always the norm and introduce these things that which our children are telling us that says, hey, this is what I bring to you. And we have to meet them there in the context of making those necessary changes to arrive at the solutions that we say we want for our children. And maybe in these types of rites of passage, we begin to lay out some of these things in the foundation. I spoke earlier in terms of a mentor of mine, Dr. Claude Anderson, whom we've had here. And in reshaping black neighborhoods, whether it's in Bermuda, the Caribbean, or the United States. And he advocates and he states that you can't find a black neighborhood in America, much less on the planet. But we must begin to, as we talk about meeting our children's needs, that as we turn them into owners, they become owners, understanding first that the first foundation is we give them an economic platform. Then we teach them a political platform, knowing who to vote for, who not to vote for, and hey, why not vote for yourself? 3, what is the role that the health and medicine plays in the mental health aspect of your life? There's a role that we play, and of course media. And we know the implications of media on the psyche of our children. But we must teach them and show them not just to use social media, but how do you own social media in a technological age? And finally, then at the 5th level, which is important but the least important of what I've listed, we have to get to, again, the quality of education for our children that teaches them a sense of ownership. So, in the educational context, in terms of that framework that I just indicated, in terms of building community, we can arrive at also teaching our children, teaching our communities, or converting our neighborhoods into communities where they begin to understand some of the fundamentals of developing community wealth. Done.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's hear it one more time for our presenters, our panelists. There's quite a few things that I personally took away from each one of you, especially with the biopsychosocial approach that you use in dealing with the success coaching over at Halifax. Even just having open conversation about, the problematic sexual behavior and just being able to introduce that conversation into our communities to address the issues that might be at hand. I really like the metaphor of the fish in the water and how our job is to make sure that we're working with a nutrient-rich environment so that our black boys and by chance, have a good time swimming. I definitely want to applaud Dr. Whiting with the SIM model and dealing with boys and their identities. And then just seeing and hearing from Dr. Liu the issues that might plague our own communities are introduced, in other communities as well, and having an attempt or a structure or a platform in which we can address those things. Everything combined, for me, reminded me of a book that I read over this past summer, The Boy Who Was Raised by a Dog, by Dr. Bruce Bowen. He has a lot of implications when it revolves around trauma and how to deal with those things. So I think that is a great read that you might want to look into, and hopefully just think about the cultural sensitivities and your own framework and context of how those things can be applied, but it would be great. So at this time, I want to open up the mics for your concise questions that you've been writing throughout the course of the presentations. There are 2 mics, one on the right side of the room and one on the left. If you have any questions, you may approach now. No? Okay, so seeing none, oh yeah, we do.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Darren Woods. I'm a community support worker at the Family Center, a local charity here. I have a question for the 2 workers at the Ministry of Education here in Bermuda. The things that were both presented on have been issues for a very, very long time in Bermuda. In your positions, what are you guys doing to actively make changes within the things that you've said to create policies that actually support our young black males in our education system at the moment?
want to put it on me? What are the things? It's not on. What are the things you say that we are doing? Sir, some of the things that we're doing that speaks to solutions have been, for example, and I know there is a presentation that comes up later today that will speak to the role that career pathways is playing. And I will say, based on the Mensa report, as a result of the Mensa report, that's probably one of the fundamental things that has come out of the Mensa report in the education system in terms of how we have went full steam ahead with the career pathways. And it's beautiful to watch our children be successful in it, because some of them have gone on and received certification in the insurance industry. We've had students also be beneficiaries of dual enrollment, and so they have graduated not just as high school students, they have graduated also with their 2-year degree from Bermuda College, to whom we are grateful for as partners in this year. There are those things. If you reflect even at the early childhood level, there are some transformative things that's going on there, because in my perspective, that's where the real work needs to begin or needs to be done. We do a lot of work where we are reimagining and revisioning early childhood in Bermuda. And a fundamental question that we do ask people is, what type of child do you want? What type of Bermudian child do you want? So that question alone speaks to our conviction and purpose in terms of how do we partner with your agency and the school and other communities to make it happen in terms of meeting the genius of our children.
Okay, I have a quick question. Dr. Whitney?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to know with the Vanderbilt program, and you said that the program that you have, have you tried
Which program? I need you.
the Vanderbilt program for the boys?
Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt.
Oh, I thought you was talking to me or him.
Yeah, I was,
Yeah, I thought you said Lou.
I was hoping. I was hoping you were talking to him.
Have you
Check.
kept in contact
Check,
with those young men, and
Check
what
one.
happened after they transitioned out of your program?
Right.
Did they go on to do other things?
Yes.
And what did they do? In particular, the ones that were interviewed,
Right.
but
Yes.
in general as
Right.
well, but in particular ones that you interviewed, and have they came back to kind of lend support to the program?
Okay, thank you. Yes, well, longitudinal studies is what we're all about, trying to find out if this is a placebo effect or just we cut the cherries off the tree, or if we just work with Anyway, so this cohort we worked with for 5 or 6 years. So we took them from 5th to 7th grade to graduation. The graduation rate, as we said, in Nashville at the time, Nashville, Tennessee, was at 47%. We had 85 to 90% of the upper level of the group, like about 50 of them, and then the other 40 or so were actually about 85. So we almost doubled the graduation rate, first off. Because they had good mentoring and role modeling as well as sponsorship, I would say more than 70% of them got to 4 years college and universities. And whether they come back or not, after that point, I got to go off and do something else, right? So it's very important for us to try to find out what works and then retread. How far do we go down? Do we go down to the primary school grades, your 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade? I say yes. The sooner we get them, the better. Then we won't have to deal with broken children, repairing broken children, as Frederick Douglass talks about. All right? If you save them as kids, you don't have to worry about broken men.
I do want to point out that this is probably like one of the dilemmas we have, right? And this is where, or at least my work is trying to focus on. Like, there should be, in most communities, a continuum. So the question isn't where did he take them? The question is who did he pass them to?
Right.
And in many cases, our communities are not, we don't have that. We have it, but it's not aligned, right? So we have people doing all kinds of stuff, and then we have another group that says, oh, we're coordinated here, but coordinated doesn't necessarily mean working together. It just means we just know what we're doing. And then when you get to that, right, so when we get to this point where, working this model, it'll probably, I'm presenting it next week, actually, on this whole notion of braided alignment. And you think about rope, like most people don't, rope is kind of, I do stuff on boats, right? So rope is is a bunch of threads, and the more you braid it, the more the stronger it gets. Our community is afraid, and sometimes it's just a bunch of fabric, right, that nobody's actually braiding or even thinking about braiding. So some of the work that I think we need to do is at the systems level and think about our own system or our work, even as us in the academy or those who are still in the academy, are thinking about how they participate in that work. Like, we have put ourselves in many cases on our own islands because we've fallen into the trap of the academy. That itself is a trap, right? And that the mashing or the separation of ourselves, our work, from communities like this brother is representing is extremely problematic, and it actually, I think, exacerbates our demise because it looks like we have all these resources, and we do, but when they're not together, they're not effective or efficient, and they're not actually helping us, to be quite honest. So if you think about his work, your question points to where do we pass along from early childhood to early education. We talk about school readiness to early education through the lifespan, like this whole life course approach. And I think once we start having that conversation at the systems level is really when we're going to see change.
When we look at this, you understand that this was a convenient sample,
Right.
right? So doing it at the college and university, it doesn't stop there. For master's students in the audience, they need scholar identity for their doctoral work. Doctoral students need it for their writing, their first-year professors. So it's actually a foundational structure for all the things that are happening here and here. We need to know about build strong self-efficacy, whether you're the coach, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a parent, whether you're a community servant, whether you're a police officer. Why are we not building self-efficacy in our children as soon as they're there rather than building the deficit kind of modeling of whatever, which gets in, there's so much built in here. In the respect for time and other folks on the panel, we have just that amount of time. Each one of our colleagues here and in the audience have bodies of work that are their life's work, yeah? So the collaboration is what's happening. So I work with community center folks to try to get them to understand how do you work with the guys who just come to the basketball gym or just on the pitch, you know? So it does become that braided network. And Dr. Caldwell and I went to a program they had this summer, and it was just phenomenal what we just saw here. That is just like not even a snapshot of what's there. We spent 2 days, 16 hours just grinding it out, and it was, I walked home, my head was like, okay.
Yeah, a rope with many strings is not easily broken. I really love that strategy. So hopefully these gatherings, this colloquium is the beginning of those conversations to strengthen that rope and put that fabric to use. So it looks like we have one more question, and then we'll go ahead and make our, 2 more questions. I think we have enough time to answer both.
All right, good morning. My name is Andy Perez, and I have a question for the lady on the table. You see how you were saying you keep, like when things happen, especially to young people, young black males in the community, they stay quiet, so like nobody knows about it. If I'm wondering if they're going to stay quiet, or we're going to make sure everybody know about it, or you're going to keep it low key as it's been happening.
Dr. Howard?
I think I understand that if a young person has a situation that occurs to them, in terms of keeping quiet, I'm talking about sharing it with someone so that they can work through the issue that is impacting them. And it has to be someone, of course, that they're going to trust with that information and also believe in. So at times they don't readily disclose what's happened. Over time they do, but usually in some cases when they don't disclose is what we see behaviors of acting out, sometimes becoming unruly in the classroom or being able to manage in the school environment because of the underlying problem that they're dealing with. It's very emotional to them.
Thank you.
Did I touch on what you're...
Kind of.
Okay, you want to ask another question then, perhaps?
No, I'm all right, thanks.
Fine, okay. Thank you.
All right, and our last question.
Good morning. Dr. Lou Matthews, thank you very much for talking about my alma mater.
Simmons.
Oh, Simmons, I'm sorry. Simmons.
From Somerset.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
The Bermuda Technical Institute. I was one of the last class of '68 in that particular institution. To Dr. Colwell, I'm very interested in the work that you're doing or collaborating with. I was just wondering whether or not you've defined it in terms of name of what exactly this thing is that you're trying to bring together. I'm an IT type of guy, and data and enterprise architecture is my focus right now. So I implore you to try to define exactly what this thing is in terms of collaborative, so that as you get together and broaden your scope of people coming to this particular thing, it is something that you can just plug people into and the work just continues. So really it's not questions, I'm just making statements based on observations. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Let's hear it one more time for our panelists. Oh, you have a question? No. What time do you have? One, okay. This will be our last question.
Okay, final question. This question is actually for Dr. Simmons. I heard you, or in your presentation, you mentioned an emphasis on technical education, right? And just thinking about it within the context of the Black community, even in the States, often there's a negative connotation associated with technical education that's perpetuating underclass for our people. And so I'm wondering which strategies have you utilized or to engage the community here to actually inform them about technical education, and also equally how you engage community partners to help you with that work.
Good question. As I was elaborating, sharing with the young man in terms of what we're doing with the career pathways, because in this community there has been this dualism or dichotomy about academic and hands-on. And hands-on is always associated with technical. And so there's a re-education process, ongoing re-education process that we have going on as we speak to, for example, as we've introduced our career pathways. We have had significant industry support in that process in terms of bringing them together and supporting us as partners in schools. Interestingly, as a result of doing this here, just recently, we introduced with our partners of Bermuda College applied technology courses as dual enrollment. And what has this done? Well, it has brought in students who normally wouldn't be doing dual enrollment, but are very skilled, knowledgeable in terms of computer technology, in terms of air conditioning, in terms of refrigeration, in terms of electrical, auto mechanics, and it's just taking it to a whole different mindset in terms of what the males, certainly as males and females, but the males who have been turning up has been, man, it's been just a joy to observe, you know, the interest and enthusiasm. So you have to involve community partners. And of course, parents. You know, we met with all of our parents for the first cohort of students who came through. And these are parents, after communicating with their own children, wanted their children to be a part of this. They called for it. We answered the call. And like I said, brought all the stakeholders together to show how out of this also is not just going through the traditional academic route, because these are students also who will have opportunity of apprenticeships in the field of interest that they have identified. These are the things that we're doing, and it's just an ongoing re-education process, brother.
All right, so I'd like to thank everyone one more time. We're going to go ahead and transition over to lunch, where we will hear from a dynamic speaker, Dr. Joseph White. Please take a couple moments to visit the vendor tables out in the foyer, and lunch will be served. We'll see you next door.